March 1977. Studio 1, NBC Burbank. The red light above camera 2 blinked on, and Dolly Parton smoothed the sequins on her dress for the 7th time in 60 seconds. The Tonight Show was not a television program. It was a national referendum conducted nightly before 15 million witnesses. A courtroom where reputations were built or dismantled in the 18 feet between Johnny Carson's desk and the guest chair. That distance, shorter than a bowling lane, wider than the Grand Canyon for anyone who had never crossed it before, represented the most consequential walk in American entertainment. Careers ended there. Legends began there. And on this particular evening in early spring, a 31-year-old country singer from Sevier County, Tennessee, was about to discover which category would claim her. Dolly Parton was not unknown. By 1977, she had already accumulated a catalog of country hits, a partnership with Porter Wagoner that had defined a decade of the Grand Ole Opry, and a reputation in Nashville that placed her among the genre's elite. But Nashville was not America. The Tonight Show was America, or at least the version of America that mattered to the entertainment industry, the version that could transform a regional phenomenon into a household name, that could take someone the coasts had never heard of and make them unavoidable by sunrise. Carson's couch was the bridge between credibility and celebrity, and crossing it required more than talent. It required his approval, offered or withheld through mechanisms so subtle that most of the audience never consciously registered them. A tilt of the head, a pause before laughing, the decision to invite a guest back to the desk after their segment or let them exit through the curtain into professional purgatory. Parton understood this. Everyone who walked through that curtain understood this. What made her particular crossing noteworthy was not that she was nervous. Every guest was nervous, even those who pretended otherwise, but that her entire professional future depended on convincing America that she was something other than what they expected her to be. The blonde hair, teased and sculpted into architectural defiance of gravity. The figure that had already become the subject of crude jokes and tabloids and late-night monologues before she had ever appeared on late-night television herself. The accent, thick and unapologetic, that could be dismissed as charming or ridiculed as ignorant, depending on how Carson chose to frame it. She had to make them see past the surface or make the surface itself into armor, and she had approximately 7 minutes to do it. The Tonight Show operated on a logic that transcended mere entertainment. It was a sorting mechanism, a cultural filter that determined which personalities were granted access to the mainstream and which remained confined to their niches. Carson had not invented this power. Jack Paar and Steve Allen had sat behind similar desks before him, but he had refined it, had turned it into something approaching statecraft. His authority derived not from cruelty, but from precision, from an ability to read a guest's vulnerabilities and decide in real time whether to exploit them or shelter them. He could make a nervous actor seem charming by leaning into their discomfort with warmth, or he could make them seem pitiable by allowing silence to stretch just a beat too long. The choice was his and his alone, and the guest had no recourse but to navigate whatever terrain he chose to create.
For women, the calculus was more complex. The desk was a space designed for a particular kind of masculine ease, the ability to trade jokes, to deflect sincerity with irony, to project competence without seeming to try. Women who appeared too polished risked seeming calculating. Women who appeared too emotional risked seeming unstable. Women who appeared too beautiful risked not being taken seriously. And women who appeared too sexy, well, the show had a long history of reducing such women to props for jokes they had not been invited to write. Parton was entering with all of these disadvantages at once, amplified by an aesthetic that seemed designed to trigger every possible dismissal. She was not ignorant of this. Years later, in interviews, she would describe the Tonight Show appearance as one of the most frightening moments of her professional life, not because she feared failure, but because she understood that the wrong kind of success, being laughed at rather than with, being admired as a novelty rather than an artist, would be worse than not appearing at all. The set itself was a marvel of controlled artifactality. The backdrop of the Burbank skyline, painted and lit to suggest a cosmopolitan sophistication that bore no relationship to the actual industrial sprawl outside the studio walls. The desk, positioned at a slight angle to suggest casual conversation while ensuring that Carson remained the visual center of every frame. The couch, positioned lower than the desk, a detail so subtle that audiences never noticed it, but that reinforced the hierarchical relationship between host and guest. The applause sign, ready to cue approval or withhold it, transforming a live studio audience into an instrument Carson could play with the precision of a conductor. Every element had been calibrated over 15 years of nightly broadcasts to create an environment that felt spontaneous while remaining entirely under his control. Parton had prepared. She had watched the show obsessively in the weeks before her appearance, studying not just Carson's interview style, but the guests who succeeded and those who floundered. She had rehearsed lines, polished stories, constructed a persona that could navigate the narrow corridor between authentic and performative. But preparation could only accomplish so much. The Tonight Show was live, taped live, broadcast later, but performed without a net, without the ability to retake a failed joke or rephrase a clumsy answer. Once the curtain opened, there was only the long walk across the stage, the handshake, the descent into the couch, and then 18 minutes in which every word, every gesture, every laugh or silence would be judged by an audience that had not yet decided whether to accept her. The interview began conventionally enough. Carson asked about her background, her music, her rise in country charts. His tone was genial, the questions designed to let her tell her story without interruption. This was the test that preceded the test, a chance to establish comfort, to let the guest settle into the rhythm of televised conversation before the real examination began. Parton navigated it smoothly, deploying the stories she had prepared, allowing her accent to work as texture rather than distraction. But then Carson shifted, and the room shifted with him. He made a joke about her appearance. Not a cruel joke, Carson was rarely cruel, but a joke nonetheless, one that acknowledged the elephant in the room and forced Parton to decide how she would respond. She could have deflected with modesty, a safe choice that would have positioned her as self-effacing, grateful for the attention, unthreatening. She could have pretended not to understand, a choice that would have confirmed every stereotype about country singers and Southern women. Or she could meet him directly, claim the joke as her own, refuse to be embarrassed by the thing he was inviting the audience to find embarrassing. She chose the third option. She laughed, not a polite laugh, but a full, genuine laugh, and then she made a joke about herself that was sharper and funnier than his. The studio audience erupted. Carson leaned back in his chair, surprised, delighted, and the entire texture of the interview changed.
This was the transformation that mattered. Parton had not simply survived the appearance, she had redefined its terms. Instead of allowing Carson to control the narrative of her image, she had claimed it, had made her appearance into a kind of weapon, not defensive but celebratory, a refusal to accept shame for choices she had made deliberately. In the years that followed, she would build an empire on this foundation, a career that spanned music, film, and business, always rooted in the same principle. She would decide what her image meant, not the audience, not the critics, not the late-night hosts who thought they were doing her a favor by letting her sit on their couches. But the origin point was that moment on Carson's couch, the moment she refused to be the punchline and became the author instead. The desk sat between them, solid and immovable, the physical embodiment of the power dynamic that structured every Tonight Show interview. But what Parton understood, what she demonstrated that night, was that the desk was not a barrier, but a bridge. Carson could invite guests across it, but guests could also demand passage. They could insist on being taken seriously, on being seen as more than the sum of their surfaces. And if they were skilled enough, funny enough, quick enough, they could turn the interview from an interrogation into a conversation. The desk did not move, but the balance of authority could shift,
and for 18 minutes in March 1977, it did. The cultural impact was not immediate. Television in 1977 moved faster than silent film, but slower than the internet age that would follow. Parton's appearance aired, was watched by millions, was discussed briefly, and then faded into the continuous churn of nightly broadcasts. But it lingered in the memories of industry professionals, in the calculations of producers trying to decide whether this country singer could cross over into mainstream success. The Tonight Show appearance had served its function. It had granted permission. Permission for casting directors to imagine her in film roles. Permission for pop radio stations to play her music without fear of alienating their audiences. Permission for America to accept her on her own terms, rather than insisting she conform to narrower expectations. This was the alchemy that The Tonight Show performed nightly, the reason its influence extended so far beyond the 18 minutes of any individual interview. It was not simply exposure. Plenty of shows offered exposure. It was legitimation, the cultural equivalent of a passport stamp that allowed performers to cross borders they had previously been barred from. And Carson was the sole authority who could grant or deny that stamp. He had not created this system, but he had mastered it, had learned to wield it with a combination of instinct and calculation that made him the most powerful gatekeeper in American entertainment for 30 years. The applause sign blinked on as the interview concluded. Parton stood, shook Carson's hand, and walked back through the curtain into a future that had just been rewritten. The desk remained where it had always been, solid and unchanged, waiting for the next guest, the next test, the next judgment. And Carson remained behind it, already moving to the next segment, already forgetting the interview he had just conducted, because there would be another tomorrow night and another the night after that. This was the nature of The Tonight Show. It was simultaneously the most important platform in entertainment and a content factory that consumed and discarded moments with industrial efficiency.
But some moments refused to be discarded. Some moments accumulated weight over time, became touchstones, entered the mythology of television history. Parton's appearance was one of these. Not because of what was said, the specific words have faded from cultural memory, but because of what was demonstrated, that a woman could be beautiful and intelligent, sexy and serious, southern and sophisticated, all at once without apology or explanation, that the desk did not have to be a barrier, that even in the most controlled environment in television, there was room for subversion, for guests to seize power from hosts who thought power could not be seized. The desk, finally, was the symbol that mattered, not the curtain, which represented mere theatricality, not the microphone, which represented only voice. The desk represented authority, the ability to ask questions and frame answers, to decide which stories mattered and which could be dismissed. It was furniture, but it was also infrastructure, the foundation on which the entire edifice of The Tonight Show was constructed. And what Parton proved was that guests could build their own foundations if they were willing to risk the construction. They could refuse the frame, reject the narrative, insist on complexity where simplicity was expected. They could, in short, be more than guests. They could be equals. This was not the story The Tonight Show told about itself. The official story was one of genial entertainment, of Carson as the friendly Midwestern host welcoming guests into his living room for a chat. But the actual mechanism was more intricate, more fraught, more consequential than the marketing suggested. It was a battleground disguised as a conversation, a test disguised as an interview, a judgment disguised as a joke. And the guests who succeeded, the ones who returned, who built careers, who became legends, were the ones who understood this and prepared accordingly. Dolly Parton walked into Studio One terrified because she understood what was at stake. She walked out triumphant because she had been willing to gamble everything on her ability to control her own narrative. And The Tonight Show, which had destroyed careers and built legends for 15 years before she arrived, and would continue for 15 more after she left, added another entry to its ledger, another moment in which the distance between the desk and the couch was crossed successfully. Another night in which America watched someone transform from a guest into a star and believed they were simply witnessing a casual conversation between two people who had nothing at stake but the next laugh. The red light blinked off, the audience filed out, and the desk remained, solid and permanent, waiting for tomorrow's guests to discover what it meant to sit across from Johnny Carson and realize that everything they thought they knew about television authority was about to be tested.